Well, folks, people were oh so upset that the Russians would dare to sail their ships so close to Florida, somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean. Not close enough for anybody to see, but, if you close your eyes, squinting, no matter how hard you squint, you weren't going to see those Russian warships. But if you closed your eyes and you thought real hard, you could imagine somewhere out there in the Atlantic Ocean, if you're on Florida's east coast, there were a couple of Russian boats on their way to Cuba, which is totally legal. Russians are allowed to sail in the ocean, just like Americans. After all, we Americans like to sail all around the world, including the South China Sea and the Straits of Taiwan, or I should say the Straits of Formosa. I don't like using new, tiny words for things. I don't like when they change the name of places. It was always the Straits of Formosa I remember seeing on maps, so I'm going to keep calling it that. Anyway, the Ruskies, though, they're not allowed. They're not allowed to sail in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean ain't big enough for the two of us, you see. And so people in Florida were all alarmed. And, my poor elderly grandmother, she was reading about it in the newspaper, and she said, "Did you hear that the Russians were sailing right off the East Coast? Isn't that scary? I'm so scared." And because she remembers when during World War II when reading in the newspaper about the U-boats off the coast of Florida. She thinks, "Oh my gosh, this is Hitler all over again. Putin's come to invade us." And this is what our media does: riles people up and makes them think that we're going to get invaded by Russia. When in reality, what's going on? It is in fact the United States. Less than a week later, or maybe it's been more than a week. I don't know. The time's kind of blended together during the summer. It's hard to keep track of time, when I wasn't putting anything out on YouTube since, my computer was dead and all. Less than a week later, the United States bombs Russians who are enjoying time at the beach during their summer. Exactly what people were, ridiculously, absurdly worried about here in Florida. Nobody actually thought that could happen, but that was like the implication. It's like, oh my God, the Russians, they could bomb our beaches from where they are. They could shoot missiles at us. Meanwhile, America, through our proxy in Ukraine, we're using our weapons, our American bombs, are being dropped on Russian beaches. And the cope from the Ukrainian side, from the pro-Washington side, is, Crimea is part of Ukraine, so technically we didn't bomb Russia, we're bombing ourselves. Like, what? That sounds even worse. That sounds even more insane. Ukraine is using weapons provided to it by America to drop bombs on its own beaches? To drop bombs on tourists visiting their own beaches? That doesn't make it any better. So let's just be honest. The Ukrainians and the Americans wanted to murder Russian tourists, and that's what they did. I've not seen anything from the Ukrainian or the American side trying to defend this and saying that they were bombing legitimate military targets. All I've seen is a very short, 6-second video from the beach. It was recorded by a Russian showing a bunch of people on the beach and people screaming and running for their lives as there were explosions going off. And of course, the Russian government is very upset about this, and they've issued a bunch of statements, obviously blaming America for this, because of course it's America's fault if America's supplying the bombs to Ukraine, and America has made it clear that they're okay with Ukraine using bombs from America, made in America, stamped with the American flag, dropping those bombs on Russia, something that never happened even during the darkest days of the Cold War. Think about it. We have our relationship with Russia is now more hostile than at any time in American history. There was no point during the Cold War where the U.S. was bombing Russia indirectly through a proxy. The closest you could compare it to, I guess, is Afghanistan with the Taliban. But the Taliban were fighting off Russian invaders. They were not fighting Russian tourists inside of Russia at the beach. The Taliban, to my knowledge, were not bombing Russian beaches and murdering civilians. That's something that is reserved for the Ukrainians. The Taliban were far more reasonable. The Taliban, they have pretty simple goals. No matter who they're fighting, their goal is to push invaders out of Afghanistan. That's kind of their thing. So I don't know about you folks. I think that the average American probably would see this and not think twice, because I think, oh yeah, those Ruskies, they're the enemies, so they're not real people. We don't care if they die. But I think the rest of the world probably, if this can be substantiated and the Russians kind of keep this up, I think this is something worth kind of highlighting. Not that the Russians exactly have clean hands here. I'm not saying that the Russians are angels or that the Russian military hasn't bombed civilians themselves. But politically, there's a difference between a big country bombing civilians in a small country and a big country bombing civilians in another big country. For example, if we, the United States, decided to just start bombing China for some reason, if we decided to just bomb civilians in China, perhaps on an important holiday, like the Chinese New Year or something, that might be a big deal. It might be a bigger deal than the My Lai massacre. You know why? Because Vietnam is a tiny country that didn't have a lot of clout. China is a big, powerful country with nuclear weapons, kind of like Russia. In fact, Russia, last I checked, has more nuclear weapons than anywhere in the world. Now, maybe that's just because the United States doesn't disclose how many nuclear weapons we actually have. Maybe we're lying. But at least as far as admitted nuclear stockpiles, I believe Russia is still number one. And our leaders, before we were ruled by senile old men, I almost said senile old baby boomers, but I'm not entirely sure that Biden is a baby boomer. He might be a silent. I can't remember exactly where the cutoff is, but I feel like he's a bit too old to be a baby boomer. Because, he was in Congress, I believe, by 1969 or 68, and so I think he's too old. When do baby boomers start? Do they officially start at 43, or does it have to be 45? I don't know. Anyway, before we were ruled by senile old men, American leaders, as recently as Barack Obama, think about that. If only you knew how bad things really are. We're hearkening back to the nostalgic good old days of Barack Obama, when we had presidents who understood that it wasn't a good idea to antagonize other nuclear powers. Every president understood that. The only person who kind of didn't, who wanted to be, in charge of things, was Curtis LeMay. And, in history, we normally remember Curtis LeMay as a crazy warmonger. But instead, modern American statesmen, I guess, look at him as, rather than a cautionary tale, rather than, a crazy outlier, they look at him as the great hero of history, the unsung hero. The one who, a man before his time, who wasn't appreciated by his fellow countrymen. I guess Curtis LeMay was correct after all. We should be as antagonistic towards Russia as possible. We should bomb Russia if ever we get the chance. After all, Curtis LeMay was right about the AR-15, so maybe he's right about this after all. Personally, I think this is all crazy town. And, if it weren't for Joe Biden, Donald Trump would have been, the most hawkish anti-Russia president that we've had in a very long time. Because after all, it was he who decided to start providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. That was a Trump administration decision. It wasn't an Obama administration decision or a Biden administration decision. Now, Biden doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on it. And the war between the escalation in the long smoldering war between Ukraine and Russia definitely began under Biden, and I think was very much his fault. The weapons that are currently fueling that war had already begun to flow when Trump was still president. And so somehow, maybe Trump has talked about this somewhere that I haven't seen, but I haven't seen Trump talk anything about how he's going to put an end to this, other than saying, just he'll do it, because that's what he does. But, I haven't heard any specifics. I haven't heard him say, like, hey, here's where Biden messed up or something like that. Really would be nice to have some clarity on the topic. Maybe we'll get some, I doubt it, at Thursday's presidential debate. Instead, I think that Thursday's presidential debate will probably be talking about nonsense like Stormy Daniels and how Trump is actually a Russian puppet and was convicted of being a Russian puppet and stealing the election, despite the fact that he says that Biden stole the election, but a jury of your peers found that you stole the election, Mr. President. That's probably what the debate will be about. I don't know if I'm going to try my best to watch it. It'll be tough to get through, especially because they start at like 9 p.m. But my guess is the last thing that will come up, and by the last thing I mean it won't come up at all during this debate, will be these strikes on the beach in Crimea, which the Russians are so upset about, which the Russians are saying. Here's the thing, you don't have to agree with this. The Russians are saying that this strike definitively makes America party to the war. As far as they're concerned, they are at war with America, or America's at war with them. Remember George Bush's old line about 9/11? They were at war with us before we were at war with them. That's what the Russian government just told its own people. They said, we were attacked by America. Now, they're not comparing this to 9/11 in the sense that, 3,000 Russians are dead. They're not, that didn't happen. It's 5 people. But could you imagine what would be all over the news if, let's say, when those Russian ships were passing Florida, let's say that a couple of missiles fired off and hit the beach, cluster bombs, let's say, and injured over 100 people, killed 5 people, including children. Do you not think that the faces of those children would be all over the TV? Do you think the government, our American government, would just forget about that and go like, it was only 5 people. We don't want to start a war over 5 people. Are you crazy? Or what are we gonna do? Like, no, we would have nuked Russia. That's how that's how our leaders would have responded. And I'm not saying that Putin should do that. My God, no. That would be, the end of the world, literally. And so thankfully he hasn't done that. But my point is, that's what was just done to him. Something that would have provoked a nuclear response from our leaders. I believe that 100%. And so, I get that the people in charge in Washington want to push Russia as much as possible. And they love hearing that Russia considers, the United States to be a party to this war. They love hearing that Russia considers the United States to be at war with them. That's not good for me. It's not good for any of us. Like, this is something nobody's paying attention to. And nobody will pay attention to it until it starts to affect us. And you know what's going to happen as soon as that happens? Americans because the media's going to do this. They're going to say, look at this unprovoked attack by Russia. And people are going to buy it. Because, what would be a reasonable retaliation against this from Russia? Russia probably would bomb some American soldiers in Europe who are facilitating the transfer of weapons. That's the easy thing to do here. Hey, American weapons are being supplied to Ukraine and being launched against Russian civilians who are just trying to have a nice, relaxing day at the beach. And so Russia now has a responsibility, in order to save face with its own citizens. They have to do something to prevent that from happening again, or else who's ever going to go to the beach again? Who's going to trust Vladimir Putin to keep them safe? And so what Putin will have to do is launch strikes of his own against the soldiers who delivered these weapons. And so that likely will be somewhere near the Polish border. America has a massive base in Poland, which, from what I understand, is there to process weapons. It is essentially a weapons depot for Ukraine. Weapons are shipped to Europe and then processed at this facility and sent on by train down into Ukraine. And so if Russia bombs this place in response, the cries from the West will be, oh my God, Russia bombed a NATO country. They bombed American soldiers. We have to nuke them right now. This is World War III. This is the hill we have to die on. Mark my words, that's what our media will say, with absolutely zero acknowledgement of what precipitated this. The fact, the alleged fact, because again we don't know this definitively yet, but I haven't heard any counter on it. I've not heard a counter yet. If there is one, please somebody link to it in the comments. And I don't mean like NAFO clowns. I mean like if there's like actual a U.S. government denial, mainstream media reports, and they have their own alternative to this story, I will read it. I will consider it, I don't think that CNN is super credible, but obviously neither is the Russian government. So I would be happy to analyze both sources. I just haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen any mention really of this in the West. The West doesn't seem to have acknowledged this event. And so as far as I'm concerned, this is the most important issue in the world right now. And I'm saying that because of Russia's attitude so far, which so far has just been words, thank God. They haven't actually done anything substantive. They summoned the American ambassador or something like that, to scold him. But their civilians are dead. Realistically, in order to not look weak, the Russian government has to do something about this, something drastic. Not just virtue signaling against the Americans. So anyway, with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.